Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University. Welcome to episode 100 of the Experts in Sport podcast. In this special episode, we discuss where history begins, Loughborough's journey through sport. We hear stories about the early years at Loughborough from Eric McIntyre.
From that small beginnings down in the town, immediately bought land, and the first things he did on it was put on sports facilities and the outdoor swimming pool built by student labour who got a cup of tea and a bun for every session. I don't think they'd do it now for that.
And we hear about Loughborough's exciting future from Joe Marr.
Student-centred facilities that place athletes at the heart of what we do, that's driven by research, that drives that innovation. All of that is the same. I just hope the science of our research is a little bit more modern.
So let's get into this exciting podcast so we can find out where history really did begin. So today I'm with Eric McIntyre, MBE, and Pro Vice-Chancellor for Sport at Loughborough University, Joe Marr. And we're here to talk about Loughborough University and the recent release of Where History Begins, Loughborough's journey through sport. We take a tour through history to discover how a university in a small town in the middle of England rose to fame to become the leading university in the world for sport. Hi Eric, hi Joe, thanks for joining me on the Experts in Sport podcast. So in today's podcast, we're going to dive into the recently released book written by yourself, Eric. So Where History Begins, Loughborough's Journey Through Sport. And we're going to look at the past, present and future of Loughborough University. And thank you for holding up the book, Joe. Our listeners might not be able to see that, but it's a very pretty book. So thank you. So Eric, can you get us started and tell us where history really did begin for Loughborough University?
History began in the first 2 decades of last century, when a small technical institute was established in the town. That building was demolished and is now Sainsbury's supermarket. In 1915, the second principal was appointed, Herbert Schofield, and right away he had the idea that sport and recreational sport, particularly at that time, was really important for all students. At that time, most of whom were technical or art students. And what he did from that small beginnings down in the town, immediately bought land up, which is now the campus of the university, and he acquired houses to create halls of residence, which for that time was absolutely revolutionary. But in sports terms, he bought the land which is now Epinal Way, and the first things he did on it was put on sports facilities, tennis courts, eventually the track and the outdoor swimming pool built by student labour who got a cup of tea and a bun for every session. I don't think they'd do it now for that. So that's when it all began, Martin.
It's brilliant. I mean, look, I've read through the book and it's really interesting to hear about this. I know you mentioned Herbert Schofield. I think you talked about a relationship with William Brockington, some of the things I got from it. And I'm trying to look at the history and where we are now. And one of the things within it talks about Schofield's enormous capacity for hard work. And I'm not sure, Eric, but it might remind you of somebody else who's in a leadership role at Loughborough right now, or a few of them, to be honest. So with that kind of thing, some of the other things you mentioned there, you mentioned facilities and again, from what I read, they were designed by the civil engineering students and actually they were there on shovels digging things.
Yes.
And it takes me to the vision type mission and and I might mess this up. So please, Joe, if you can make this sound any better, please do so. But veritate scientia labore, so by truth, by science, by labour. I really think that kind of brings that to the fore in that there was development of the facilities by civil engineers using science, and then actually it was the students and staff putting their labour in to make things happen.
Absolutely, indeed. And that was his vision all the time, that the education on offer to students had also to have a practical outcome. And he turned that to fantastic effect with his civil engineering and other students, and then the staff, who got great benefit out of it in designing these facilities and then subsequently building them. You mentioned the Veritatis Scientia, etc. That's incredible. He managed to get, for a small college, the herald coats of the heraldry to do a coat of arms for that college. Just unbelievable what the man could achieve.
Well, like you said, he was clearly a visionary leader and a maverick getting the ball rolling at Loughborough. And I think there's many ways in which that legacy lives on. So, Joe, can you point us to where we are now and kind of what our missions and visions are and how we link to our past in what we're presently doing?
Yeah, and I think the ethos of what we do today is absolutely wedded to the ethos that Herbert Schofield set. And, you know, our Chancellor, Lord Coe, will talk about sport being in our DNA at Loughborough and that culture of students having success on the sporting field. And to give you a sense of scale, so Loughborough, there's roughly 20,000 students. 6,000 of those students compete every Wednesday in our British University Championships and colleges competition. 19,000 are members across Loughborough Sport, so students coming here to be physically active and engaged in their student experience as well as academia. None of that is different. And I think the one thing that I find really funny and interesting is back in those days we talked about the students digging the swimming pool. Actually, the labour element now, when we design sports facilities, we put some of the design elements onto our academic colleagues. So we have academic colleagues that will think about managing the airflow in an Olympic stadium that have informed the design of what happened at London 2012. If we're thinking about the swimming pool, for example, we've just done a decarbonisation project, and it's actually the staff across Loughborough Sport, supported by colleagues within the school, that are thinking about the design principles to drive some of those activities. So I think other than us asking students to lift bricks and mortar, student-centred facilities that place athletes at the heart of what we do, that's driven by research, that drives that innovation, all of that is the same. I just hope the science of our research is a little bit more modern. And if we're thinking about some of the leaders, it's actually Loughborough alumni that were the lightning rod for Labour government back in the early 2000s after the Sydney Olympics and Atlanta, when we didn't do well in Atlanta 96, that got the government to put the lottery money into sport that helped fund some of the facilities we've got today. So it's people like Baroness Sue Campbell, Lord Coe, supported by some of the local MPs at the time, like Andy Reid, who was a minister. So those people came together, supported by Loughborough's then Vice-Chancellor, to drive investment in the elite world-class facilities that you'll see on campus now, that were actually starting that modernisation process. Again, we've got 5 live projects on campus to really get to make sure that we're at the forefront of innovation.
It's brilliant for our listeners to hear it, because obviously, you know, I'm on campus and I see it every day, and we talk about the Loughborough family, but I think you've described it really nicely there in that, you know, there's leaders like yourselves, but there's academics, there's students, and then there's alumni that all come together to make this place, you know, a really amazing place to work, and hopefully to achieve things not just for the university, but for the local, the national and international population. So it is a brilliant place to be, and it's great to see that where our roots are in the past, and we're really following that tradition and moving things forward. So we're going to kind of flip forward and back through some of the history and some of the present. So I want to come back to you, Eric, and just look at, so I know things kind of developed in the early 1900s, and this was kind of pre-First and Second World War. You mentioned Herbert Schofield before, becoming appointed, I think, during the First World War.
1915.
There we go. Can you talk us through a little bit around the involvement from Loughborough around the First World War and what part we played in that?
The First World War could actually be said to be the thing that really created the whole modern Loughborough University. What do I mean by that? Schofield had the brilliant vision of production, education on production, and he started an institutional factory making shells, etc., for the war. This was so financially successful that he had a lot of money available. It was also reputationally so successful, showing what a great place it was. He was awarded the MBE himself. So after the First World War, he had a lot of money in the bank, so to speak, from that. Then, if we look very quickly forward to the Second World War, the RAF had a rehabilitation centre on Loughborough, in Loughborough campus, and that was headed by the very famous tennis commentator Dan Maskell. And the benefit of that particularly and obviously was that they put up a building and left it in 1946 after the war to the college, and that was called the Victory Hall. And of course, we must always remember in both World Wars, many Loughborough students lost their lives. So the two wars, very, very important in lots of ways to the development.
Thanks for the knowledge there, Eric. And again, every time I look at this, I just see the parallels with where we are now. So again, through reading through the book, I think there were many females employed as munitions workers, and we're on a big run now for women in sport and innovation and trying to kind of push things forward in that space. Again, it talks about engineering students and staff putting together drawings to develop these things. You mentioned the Second World War there, and we've had RAF personnel and a rehab centre. You know, this was back pre-Second World War. And I think we've carried on relationships with the military. So, Joe, do you want to kind of inform us where we are now in that?
Yeah, and I mean, the parallels, it's just incredible, isn't it? You know, what you learn from the past to take forward, because, you know, we're just close to the finalisation of constructing the National Rehabilitation Centre, you know, and that is a government programme that's £105 million. And it's a specialist facility supported by the NHS in partnership with Loughborough University, Nottingham University, near Stamford Hall. And that is going to be a defence medical rehabilitation centre. So, you know, we're absolutely driving that rehabilitation through the science and indeed the treatment and outpatient care to this very day. In addition to that, in the doing of sport, the playing of sport, this year alone, we've re-signed large memorandums of understanding with the RAF for their high performance sport provision and the Army, the British Army, for their sport provision, to make sure that we're servicing them with facilities and access to make sure that our armed forces and our military are getting the very best aspects of both sport and rehabilitation and recovery. So, yeah, those relationships are as strong today as they were pre-World War One.
It is amazing to see, and we're going to kind of repeat it, this history repeating itself, or because us pushing forward from our strong roots. So we've spoken really there a little bit about sport and health and recreation, really, and how that has been at the forefront of all the kind of research and the work that's been done. But obviously we're very well known for performance in sport. So, Eric, can you talk us through how that started to develop both recreationally and from a performance perspective?
When Schofield bought the land, which is now the campus, he immediately then created the opportunity for teams to evolve. Rugby, cricket, athletics, soccer, these were the major ones at that time. And in the first instance, they competed against local clubs. And there's a lot of records of that, very interesting things. But Schofield never sat still. And in 1929, he performed an amazing feat. He got the then very small Loughborough College into the university's athletic union. And if I tell you that in that year, one of the other places admitted was University College Dublin, he was, in modern parlance, punching way above his weight. So he now had a national reputation. And incredibly, in that first year, his hockey team won the UAU championship. As Joe will tell us, I'm sure, later, the first of hundreds of successes in the UAU and later championships. So that's when his drive for sport began. He had all this, he had the facilities going. We'll come, I know, to the education bit in a minute. But what stopped him in the beginning, in the 20s, he would have gone for education coaches, but the Board of Education wouldn't give him the numbers. Even in these days, numbers were king, as they are very much today.
Thanks, Eric. And Joe, do you want to touch upon where we are now? Because we can see there our history in success in sport and involvement in sport comes from over 100 years ago. So probably don't go through every success we've had, but as we know, we're very well known for success in sport. But I think we've moved beyond performance sport, even though it's still integral to what we do. So can you touch upon performance sport and our success, but also the wider benefits of participation and health and well-being?
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, in the back of the book that many of you will see when you purchase it, Eric did a phenomenal job to go back through both our Olympic and Paralympic medal history, and to really go back and say, when was the very, very first Loughborough Olympic medal? And in the book, it really highlights going back to 1948, where we got that very first Olympic success. And then for the Paralympics, that very first success started, a little bit later, as the Paralympic movement was a little bit later, and that was Baroness Tanni Gray-Thompson in 1992. So from an Olympic and Paralympic perspective, we like to use the phrase, if Loughborough was a country, and if Loughborough was a country, athletes associated with our ecosystem would have positioned us 15th in both the Olympic and Paralympic medals table. Regarding our students that compete for us as Loughborough University, they put the African Violet on. They're out there every Wednesday afternoon in our books competition. Books started 45 years ago, and we've just secured our 45th consecutive national championship. So, the work that our students do to represent African Violet is just phenomenal, and they take immense pride in putting on those colours, and we couldn't be more happy to see them thrive in that environment. But we've really started to make sure that we are reflecting the society that we live in, so that we should be pushing the boundaries of innovation for every athlete. So we've put a huge investment into women in sport, both from a research and performance perspective. And Loughborough Lightning has been active for over a decade, where now you'll see we've got a professional rugby team competing at national standard. We've got a semi-professional, soon-to-be professional netball team, Loughborough Lightning. They've won 2 championships in the last 3 years. And across our women's portfolio, from cycling to wheelchair basketball and many more, we've really gone out of our way to move the market in that space. And that's what's accumulated in the government now supporting our Women in Sport Research and Innovation Hub. For para and disability sport, we've got this stat, and I'm not going to quote it because I can't remember the exact kind of ranking, but just our para athletics and swimming teams, they would beat most universities on their own, because we have got so many athletes that come to us to compete within that space. And what they really like, if you talk to Thomas Youngs, who's a T38 Paralympic medalist, Thomas will say, for him to go to a books championship and to compete with any athlete, so that isn't sectioned off, it's all inclusive. He takes the most pride in kind of winning that race. Because it is where he feels, fully able to demonstrate his skills, and, what a phenomenal athlete. So we've always tried to kind of make sure we put our investment and our support in a really diverse range of areas. And we couldn't do it without partners. So from UK Sport, we're one of their elite training environments. That means that if you're an Olympic or Paralympic sport, there's sports that will effectively be allocated to Loughborough, so they could have a head office here. They might have invested back in 2000 in a high performance facility. So GB Aquatics, for example, British Triathlon, England Netball, and then other professional sports like cricket. So the ECB have their high performance centre. Their women's team and their disability and Lions team are permanently based here, and the men come in on bespoke training camps. They were here just last week on a spin bowling camp. So the partners that we work with, the LTA have one of their national academies here, anchor us in an ecosystem that covers research, high performance, playing of sport, and the education of sport all in one place. So the students get to feel the benefit of the science coming to life on the field of play, and to be around, world champions and Olympic medal winners to inspire them as part of their training as well.
It is amazing when you talk through that. And look, we both are on campus very regularly and we see it. But when you say it is phenomenal what the campus has. I remember numerous times training myself in power base and just seeing the Australian national cricket team just wandering by, or whoever else, certain professional boxers or whatever it may be. And it's just like the norm, which is a bit weird when you talk about it.
Yeah, and I think just to highlight that, we serve the community, and yes, it's brilliant to have elite athletes on campus, but I was touring a guest a couple of weeks ago, and, we go into the High Performance Athletics Centre, and Katrina Johnson-Thompson's training, world medalist heptathlete. And she was like, oh, that's great. And then we go to the swimming pool, and Alex Yee's just coming out from his session, gold medal triathlete. She was like, okay. And we turned the corner, and 100 students in swimming trunks and swimwear were doing a charity run for the Oddballs charity. She was like, oh my word, that's amazing. Like that, she was more pleased to see that, because there were so many students engaging and raising money for charity. She was like, I've seen them elite athletes, that's fine. But, the blend of what we do is so unique.
Agreed, and you've touched on all elements there, and you've got that elite element, but there's charity, and I know the Student Uni have raised millions in the past for charities and things like that. It's just such a great ecosystem to be part of. So we've touched upon kind of the sport and the development side and our students being kind of embedded in this. But when did the education and research really start in and around sport and physical education, Eric?
That was in the 1930s. By that time, Schofield had facilities. He had appointed his first members of staff, and he started under the famous F.A.M. Webster, the School of Athletics, in the 1930s. And Webster was a maverick, like Schofield loved mavericks. And what he used to do was take film of the students at school, rush down to the station, send it to Kodak down in Hemel Hempstead, and have it back the next day. Utterly revolutionary for these times in the 1930s. He wrote dozens of books on athletics, coaching and other things, and that really began to start the notion of a research base. And one of the people, the members of staff, was a very famous man, Jeff Dyson, who probably wrote the first book as a Loughborough member of staff, called The Mechanics of Athletics, which is a very famous book. He later went to Canada. We couldn't keep him here. We couldn't pay him enough in Britain. So that began in the 30s. It carried on in the early 50s with such people as the very famous Dr. Robson, who was one of the fathers of British sports medicine and who was a teacher at the College of Education. And the students published, through the Past Students Association in the 1950s, a magazine with their research projects and things like that in it, which is again for the time very unusual. So that really was, without going on too far in this, the big benefit for the education side was the 1944 Education Act, which opened up education to all, raised the school leaving age. Schofield was in prime position because he had all the facilities, he had staff, boom, he got the numbers from the government, and the rest is history. And that sped on through to the creation in the 1950s of the very, very world-famous College of Education, which trained thousands of teachers all over the world.
And I think from reading the book, I think there was strong links made there with governing bodies, which we'll touch upon later on, and how that's developed. Where did that shift come then from PE, where things started, into sports science?
Well, it wasn't obviously an overnight thing. In the 1950s, Dr. Robson wanted to do even more on the sports science side, but the then principal said, no, we want to carry on in our wonderful reputation in teacher education, and we don't want to spoil that. The real drive for sports science came in the mid-1970s, when a large sports council grant was received by the university, which allowed the appointment of Clyde Williams, who later became the head of department and the professor of sports science. And he very quickly established a research group and PhD students, etc., and that was the real taking off. And you mentioned, Martin, the work with governing bodies. Well, he was working right away with such sports as swimming, on testing, all that sort of thing, which has led, as Joe will, I'm sure, tell us, to the fantastic success of today in the whole sports science side. But it didn't mean that teacher education stopped overnight in the 1970s, and indeed it still goes on today. But it's all postgraduate now, rather than 3- and 4-year courses as in the past.
Thanks, Eric. And from reading the book, is it true that the BELIEP test was developed at Loughborough?
Yes, yeah.
So
all developed in the research group, yeah.
I don't know whether to love that or hate that, to be honest. I've run that many times.
I've certainly done a few in my time.
So maybe it is something to be proud of, but maybe not. I don't know. Maybe not. Let's not shout too loud, because maybe people won't like us for that. I seem to remember as well, I think it was called the Loughborough Intermittent Shuttle Test on a treadmill. There's a football-based test that was from Loughborough, and we named it after ourselves. Maybe we should have done that with the BELIEP test as well. Then everyone would do. I didn't even know, and I've done the BELIEP test many times.
I didn't know. Yeah.
So that's really interesting, and probably brings us to kind of looking at where we are right now. We've been rated as the best university in the world for sport-related subjects for the past 9 years. What is it that we've done to deserve such a prestigious reputation?
So the work of our academics, researchers, laboratory staff, support staff, all coming together means that they are publishing research that has impact. So this is, when we talk about sport-related subjects, I think strategically the university has done a good job in the last kind of 2 decades, predating a lot of many of us here, because you don't win these awards overnight. To get to 9 years, the work on that genuinely will have started 15 years ago because of, how the research cycles are. So if you think about a PhD on average being about 3 years in length, we need our students and academics and researchers solving globally interesting societal impacting problems through an interdisciplinary way. So if you're going to develop a set of cooling trousers for a Team GB elite athlete in the 2012 Olympics, then you need to have someone specialising in ergonomics, like Professor George Havenith. You need someone who understands physiology and the impact on the athlete body that might be from the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences. You might also pull in an engineer from our sports technology school, and then a coach and an athlete, and you'll have to run trials and data. So I think the unique feature that Loughborough does is sport is cross-cutting. If you look at the volume of schools on our campus, sport will feature in some way in nearly all of them. And when we think about a problem, we think about it in a really holistic way, and we're not afraid to push the boundaries and do things that, might at the time be perceived as, why would you do that? But actually, when you see that then becomes the world standard or the norm, we'll be advising on pregnancy guidelines, we'll be analysing case studies on social impact of hosting mega events, whatever it is, across the breadth of our sport-related academics, from our London campus to our East Midlands campus. The volume of their output, so how many times they're cited, is the research impactful, what do other academics and other employers think? All of that comes together to inform those world rankings. And
it's really interesting that we say about the cross-cutting themes there. And one of the things that I see that we have is we have the ability to move around and do things in areas that maybe weren't apparent straight away. And we've got that innovative approach. So I remember when I first started at Loughborough, my boss at the time said to me, it will probably take you about 6 months to realise what your job is.
Yeah.
And when I asked him kind of a few questions about, what he wanted me to do, he was like, I've employed you to do this. How you do it, what you do, I don't really care. If you need any help from me, I'm here. But we've employed you because we think you're the expert who can make this happen. So go and do it. So that freedom that I was given was just liberating, to be able to be set free to kind of, the podcast is one of the things that came out of that, amongst others. And I think everybody seems to have that license to go right back to where we say in that history and kind of, work hard, be innovative, work collaboratively and create change for the future. So I think it's the environment that's put together that's allowing us to continue to do this. So just to move forward, obviously we've got that reputation in sport, like practically, we've got it in research and education. We've also got an outstanding reputation that you touched upon around Olympics and the Paralympics.
Yeah.
Can you just dig a bit deeper into that to start with, Eric, of like where that began and where it moved forward? And then, Joe, we might touch upon 2012 and beyond.
Well, Joe, I think already mentioned it, that the first Olympic medalists who were associated with the then Loughborough College before the university were in 1948. Two of those medalists later came on the staff, which is actually a great tradition in Loughborough. But a lot of the high performance people did, the famous Robbie Brightwell is a classic example, came very celebrated staff members as well. So that tradition goes back to 1948. I mentioned Jeff Dyson earlier. He was the chief coach of the British athletics team and a member of staff at Loughborough before he went to Canada. And the establishment of that reputation, then the link with the governing bodies, was really important for carrying that on through the decades. I should mention 1948 that the Olympic torch relay of that time was overseen by a Loughborough man, Commander Collins, who subsequently left his Olympic torch to the university, where it still is to this day. So that tradition then carried on into the 1950s, 60s and on to the phenomenal success of today. And just while we're on, I'd love to just say I was able to trace Loughborough's oldest living Olympic medalist, John Salisbury, aged 90, from 1956, and still as lively and hale-hearty as ever, and still so proud of the experience he got in Loughborough as a trainee teacher.
Yeah, that's brilliant to hear, Eric. And I think from your book, I've written down here that apparently since 1948, Loughborough's associated athletes have won 186 medals at the Olympics. I mean, that's incredible. And we all know of the success of 2012. So again, this is research from your book. We hosted Team GB. There was 524 athletes representing all 26 Olympic sports, plus staff, coaches, officials, all collecting their kit at Loughborough campus, with 13 sports using the campus as their final pre-games training venue, and over 400 volunteer medal makers. That's immense. It's an immense contribution towards 2012. Joe, can you touch upon kind of further contributions that Loughborough have made towards 2012 and beyond? Maybe that's athletes, but maybe that's also research and development.
Yeah, and I mean, I just don't think we can talk about 2012 without giving so much credit to our Chancellor, Lord Seb Coe, who without him, you know, the Olympic Games, I genuinely believe he was obviously supported by a brilliant team and lots of colleagues, but was so pivotal in getting both the vote for us to host as a country, and then to enact a Games that I think goes down as one of the most successful in history. But when we tried to work together across the community, some of the examples that you touched on, you know, our provost, Professor Rachel Thompson, was carrying an Olympic flame down Eppinal Way as part of the torch relay. And obviously when you do that, you then get gifted the torch. And bringing together the college and the university, we had what was called the Loughborough Flames programme, where we were creating change makers and volunteers that were going into local primary schools, supported by people like Chris McGeorge, Liam Tancock, who was a world record holding swimmer, to inspire young people to come together with the British Heart Foundation support to deliver messages around physical activity, safeguarding sport, being active. And that programme just grew and grew and was the very early seedlings of what we now refer to as our coaching and volunteering academy. You know, we have a culture here at Loughborough today where students donate up to 300 hours each of community volunteering based activity. And that equates each year to something like 120,000 hours of time. I think without the Loughborough Flames project, what we now see wouldn't have kind of developed into that idea. And obviously our academics, you know, I touched earlier on the work of Professor George Hadleniff and the team around the Adidas Climacool brand and that cooling of the GB cyclists, which Sir Chris Hoy and Dame Laura Kenny have really been positive about when they've spoken to the media about the impact that had on their performance. Mo Farah had the Respi belt designed by Sports Tech. We had specific bespoke seats made for Paralympics GB wheelchair basketballers, supported by Professor Vicky Tolfrey in the Peter Harrison Laboratory. And it goes on, and I'm sure I've missed some academics off the list. I know I have, but you know, it's just a couple of examples to showcase we were driving the research and the technology that impacted the athlete performing to win the medal. We were trying to inspire the primary school children in the community to have a legacy of physical activity. And then I think the accumulation of all that coming together is why government invested with us and with a hub in Sheffield and in London in the National Centre for Sport Exercise Medicine. And that's been a building now that was built after 2012. It's been in operation. I think it's now moving into its 11th year. And you could have a 70-year-old member of the community that's fractured their hip coming into the MRI scanner or the X-rays to be referred to an outpatient clinic. Or you could have a Premier League footballer that night who needs to go and see someone. So, you know, the breadth of what the NCSEM does and the key part of being a legacy programme, as well as things like we host the National School Games final, all come together to demonstrate that 2012 is still having an impact today in 2025 on Loughborough University.
And we see that every year with the school games as well on campus. You know.
Yeah, it's incredible. Sport England and New Sport Trust work with Loughborough Sport and colleagues, and they deliver effectively an Olympic Games for school children. So that, and what I love about it is they mirror the protocols. So a young person will come at the age of 11, 12, 13, and they'll have to go and get an accreditation and a pass. They'll have to go through kitting out. Like, they will mirror what you'd expect at a major event. And the tally of how many of those young people have actually then gone on to compete and represent Team GB is incredible.
It is brilliant, and I know we've all associated with Loughborough and we're banging on about how great it is, but it's really incredible to sit here and talk about the success that we've had over the past 100 years. But I'm very aware that this is where history begins, so I'm sure the best is still to come. So Joe, as Pro Vice Chancellor for Sport, can you tell us what the future plans are for Loughborough, so we can continue with this unrivaled success in sport?
Yeah, and listen, none of what we've talked about today happens without strategic partners and being collaborative and having an open and growth mindset. So, the work we do both across government, with colleagues at DCMS, with UK Sport, with the BOA, BPA, to name so many of them together, we are trying to make sure that we continue to drive global impact. And that is core to what we do. So we've got to work together to use our influence. And one example is we're currently adopting a ministerial direction to try and improve insurance products for female athletes who, over a period of time, they've been disadvantaged in that space as a product of being a woman. So if we help influence a change to the industry, that means that any female athlete in the world will get a better product in the future as a result of a sector-driven piece of work that Loughborough supported. And that's just one example of many where we want to make sure our research develops impact, that we train the future leaders, governors, sports scientists, teachers, so that when you graduate from Loughborough, you graduate with the history of that brand behind you and the confidence to go and do good. So we talk about, we train suits, tracksuits and lab coats, and it's influencing every layer of sport, from the governance, legislation, to teaching, to performing, to research and education. And if we continue to do that with a modern ethos of trying to create more equality and equity where we can, trying to break down barriers and trying to push the boundaries of human performance, hopefully we will continue to inspire, to be collegiate, to be collaborative, and make a lasting impact on communities. Because what we know is if we could prescribe sport to everybody in the world, then we would have a much healthier global society and reduce the pressure on health services.
I love that the conclusion really from yourself that you've brought there in terms of where we started and where we've gone, and the sport and the health and how everything fits together. I mean, but the big things to me are that we are rooted in our history. I think that's really important to say. And I think the thing that's kind of flowed through to me is that kind of personalities, passion and collaboration have always been part of what we've done. And what we do now, and it's that support from senior leadership, it's staff, and that's staff all across campus, whether it's academics, whether it's practical staff, all the way through. And it's always cliche nowadays to say, oh, and the cleaner, but it is that kind of thing. It is everybody on campus, and it's genuine. Historically there was that drive for sport, which has now reached much broader, starting with education and PE, and going to sport and sports science and sports tech and all these different areas. And now we're looking at that kind of those global issues. So through that strategy of creating better futures together and those core beliefs that we can make the difference in a number of areas, I think the success that's going to come and continue to come is so exciting to be a part of. So really want to say, Eric, thanks very much for doing this history, because I think for staff, for alumni, and for people who want to learn more about Loughborough, the passion that comes through from this book and the history just makes everybody really proud to be part of it. And then thank you to you as well, Joe, because the drive that you've come in with and the passion that you have to kind of continue this and make it even bigger and better is huge. And, staff want to be a part of it, and we want to keep going in terms of what's next for us. Where has history begun and where can we be is that next question. So thank you both for your time. It's been brilliant speaking to you. And I hope listeners, you've got to feel that sense of passion that we all have for this place, and how that history has really developed into what we have now.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@alborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.